right? So normalizing anger, not crazy expression of it, but normalizing the experience of it is already a connecting. We don't think of anger as a connecting emotion because of the bad ways that people tend to express it and what we've seen, right? And so this is a real challenge. I'm not saying that this is, the social coordination, the social conduct, all of these things that these people talk about, they're not so easy. And they're filled with avoidance strategies.
I'm Cindy Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosophers. Today's guest on The Erotic Philosopher is Eric Schneider. For the past 33 years, Eric has been a dynamically oriented psychotherapist. His work brings to light historic adaptations, challenging early experiences that impair our current relational context, both in terms of emotional closeness and authentic self-expression and sexuality. Currently, Eric's completing his Ph.D. dissertation examining current worldviews with respect to romantic relationships. He's also a practitioner of various Daoist arts and sciences for the past 50 years. When he's not working, he enjoys playing the clarinet, ventriloquism, and he's amazing at it, and puppetry. He lives in New York City with his partner, a parrot, and their little dog, Bodhi. Enjoy this conversation with Eric Schneider. Eric Schneider, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. We get to hang out.
Yeah, we get to hang out. And in this sort of virtual in-person world that we've all been living in. And so folks who are not familiar with you are going to be introduced to you by way of being a friend of mine, obviously, an associate of mine, a psychotherapist based in New York City. But what do you want people to know about you? People from other parts of the world, other parts of the galaxy who perhaps are not therapists. What would you like folks to know about you?
As a therapist or just me as a person? I think, I don't know. I think in this particular context, me as a therapist and what some of my values are might be useful. At least some of the values I think I have would be more accurate. In terms of I have very humble aspirations for what psychotherapy can offer. And in my work, a lot of the work is focused on the experiential, the here and now relationship that's evolving between me and someone I'm spending some time with as a client or a patient, depending on what people want to call it. And what their issues are, how their issues highlight internal conflicts that they might be having that are impairing their ability to either be more of who they can be, or have relationships that are satisfying and gratifying as much as possible.
So I think that's a really important thing that you sort of touched on there that we'll dive into, is this notion of relationships with others being informed by our relationship with ourselves. And the fact that so many of us either, we don't get that memo. I don't think anybody actually gets that memo ever, in any part of the world. But also that we are spoon-fed from a young age, that relationships are about the other and pleasing the other, and this kind of notion of also, you complete me, that when you find the twin flame, the soulmate, all this kind of stuff, that you'll magically know, and it will be this effortless connection, and that you will feel complete, and you will always feel complete because this person just magically erases all the stings and the wounds and the pain of the past, and they're just there. And yet, and I know from our work, and probably from our own lives as well, that that's all horse shit. And that's not how relationships work. And so you've been working with couples of all stripes, all configurations for over 30 years. What have you seen that are some of the roadblocks to connection? And I mean real connection, not Hallmark card connection, but real connection.
Yeah. I hear what you're asking. Before I dive into that with you, which I think is a really rich place to start exploring, I also want to say that the landscape in which relationships, the sociocultural context in which relationships take place, as you allude to some of those influences, the Disneyfication, the pornification, the Disneyfication of relationships, the pornification of sexuality, these are later evolutions, right? But these dyads, or whatever form a relationship might potentially take, or what kind of relationship is desired, they live within a sociocultural milieu, and that has changed so much. With all sorts of forces at play, given sort of the way in which technology has amplified, kind of a consumer mentality, and the further commodification of self as a product or something.
You're talking about swiping culture and that kind
swiping
of stuff.
Culture, hookup culture in some ways, and I don't mean to come across as denigrating any of that. All I'm saying is we have to be conscious of the environment in which relationships potentially can take place. If I'm engaging in swiping culture, I'm engaged in practice that reinforces certain attributes that are antithetical to, as you were saying, real connection, right? If, as I had a wonderful Tai Chi teacher, wonderful in many ways, not so wonderful in other ways, but a really good man, who used to say, you get good at what you practice. But unfortunately, practice is not always conscious, and we're not always aware of what we're doing. And so within the commodification, Erich Fromm talked about this in 1952 when he talked about how consumerism was impacting love, right? And he talked about love being an art. I don't want to go too far into that, but the fact of the matter is,
say something about consumerism impacting love. So in lay people's terms, what does that mean?
Well, we practice shopping,
right.
That's
about
kind of our practice,
as a
right?
Kid. Right. Yeah.
Right. I have this idea about what I want, right? What my desires are, and that may be a good place to start in terms of as I go out into the world to connect with others. I'm going to encounter my preferences. I like this, I don't like that, and so and I'll make choices based on those preferences. But those preferences can also become ossified in a way, like kind of very rigid, and it makes the filter by which we can relate more about buying or buying someone. We don't think of it that way, but that's our practice. And so I like this, I don't, and people become objects. And the truth of for me, at least the way I've seen this, is that as we objectify others, we also objectify ourselves. So we're productizing ourselves as well, which means that and then all of a sudden we want connection and intimacy, right? So it's like, well, how do you do that? You've been doing this other thing for so long, and you've habituated to this, and now you want emotional closeness, right? That's what we mean. I mean, or at least I think what most people mean when they talk about intimacy, they're really referring to emotional closeness. But emotional closeness has also become consumerized, right? We have the authenticity police and the vulnerability police. And now we're being asked to be different than our practice, in a sense. And that can really, really, really impair and impact, heart to heart, belly to belly, eye to eye closeness. That's not the only form of intimacy, right? Often people, because of our sociocultural context, often esteem emotional intimacy, and they overlook other forms of intimacy. And they think that because the emotional closeness isn't coded in the way that they think it should be, they also overlook the ways that they are being emotionally close, but without that sort of intense eye gazing, heart to heart, belly to belly, right? It's like, can you be in the same room with someone you care about and not actually speak a word?
Right. So those kinds of intimacies that, because we're given this drip filtered hallmark version of intimacy, which used to be, I guess it used to be strictly heterosexual. It used to be strictly monogamous. It used to be about expectations and assumptions that growing up we were all fed the rules that this is how relationships work. We see it modeled on TV and in movies and maybe with our family of origins, but often not.
Well, you're making a very important point. I'll interrupt only to build on what you're saying. Post World War II, we were spoon-fed social scripts that were supposed to fulfill all of these wants and desires. And the 60s certainly went, oh my God, that's not what's happening here. And we had all these movements that really turned that upside down, right? Divorce rates went up. LGBTQ rights, the civil rights movement, all of these were about saying these scripts don't work, right? And then we're left in the position that you're talking about with lots of tropes, lots of sort of cultural tropes and ideals that still live in our consciousness, right? And so, yes, and I interrupted you just at the point where you were.
No, well, I was going to say that, we were fed all of these stories, and then, fast forward now to the 2020s, where we're swiping, where, certainly in the more progressive parts of the world, non-traditional relationships are much more visible. Queerness is almost not even queer anymore. It's sort of an addendum to the mainstream. And yet still, even though we have all of this information, we have access to porn and sex information on tap. We have Instagram to tell us all about attachment, and Brené Brown to tell us all about vulnerability and authenticity and all of these fabulous things. And don't get me wrong, I think Brené Brown is extraordinary. And still, we collectively don't know how to make meaningful relationships, whether they last one evening, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year. The difficulty so many of us have with that connection, despite having more information than we've ever had in the history of humans. Where do we go from here? How do we deal with this epidemic of loneliness in relationships?
Yeah. Your question is really important, right? You said something that really strikes me. We're more informed than we've ever been. Right? We have so much information. It's almost like information overload, but information only informs so much, right? It can give us conceptualizations. It can give us language. It can give us ways of understanding, but from a very, very cognitive level of understanding. To your point, and to my point, those scripts of the 50s, what's her name? Turkle wrote that book, The Way It Never Was, which is, sort of that history. And Chaucer wrote a lot about that as well, saying, oh yeah, okay, but these, they didn't provide. And so it's not like it was great back then and it's horrible now, right? I want to make sure that, this has always been a difficulty. And if we look at ancient civilizations throughout history, relationships, if we look at poetry and music, and it's all about relationships and the challenges we all find within them. So how do we deal with this epidemic of loneliness? I think that, and I agree with you. I think queer theorists critiqued many of those relational scripts and the sexuality. We're in a world of sort of sexualities and intimacies and relationalities, and that we're kind of in a Tower of Babel. Right, we're kind of in this Tower of Babel trying to figure out how do we coordinate a relational, what Maturer, who was a Chilean biologist, called, a consensual social domain in which we can share space together, not just physical space, but psychological space. And I think in addition to the narratives that you described, there's another narrative, right, which is to maximize, optimize, leverage, idealize, reach some.
That's the consumerist, isn't
Right,
it? It's
right. It's the consumerism of kind of psychology, coaching, that realm as well, which then creates, depending on how you're wired, has you evaluating, and can really lean on the side of, oh, this is disappointing. This isn't living up to my expectations, right? And then, okay, so this relationship, this person, I start, if I've been successful at commodifying the other, it's very easy then to dispose of the other.
That is really powerful. I think that is such an important piece of this, that the disposability of each other in friendships, in intimate partnerships, again, whether it's for a night or a year, it still is that sense of, if you can't give me what I want, if I can't get what I want, then, I've got to move on and this isn't working, as opposed to being with, staying with, and looking within oneself for some inspiration around, being able to even identify what the problem is. Sometimes we almost start from that place of looking for solutions, but we haven't even identified what the problem is yet.
You're again, another very good point. There is a lot of premature solution looking for, right? In other words,
my friend Doug Bruin Harvey refers to them as premature evaluations.
Yeah, premature evaluations, premature solutions. Absolutely. I've, as a therapist, I get to sort of stand back a little bit, over the years, and currently over the last 10 years, 5 years, I'm going to say between 5 and 10 years, there has been more and more, how do you questions, right? And these are questions of trying to figure out something that someone is having some issues with or some struggle with. And without clear identification of that struggle that one has, one is really working against oneself when that happens. So your query is a very valuable one. How does someone, where do we go from the loneliness pandemic, which is not just because we're not in a relationship, but even when people are in a relationship, they often feel lonely or alone. And the issues are unclear. And often one of the things that happens, especially when people do have relationships, is there is always a convenient scapegoat for whatever it is that you're feeling, right? And you pointed out, this kind of ideal people have about relationships is even within the literature itself. In other words, that a relationship is defined by someone who meets our needs, whose needs we meet, and all this other stuff. But at the same time, the term need is also an abused term. It's used for everything. I need you to take out the garbage. Okay, well, wait a minute. You want me to take out the garbage? That's fine. Need me to take out the garbage? Like your life depends on this? So we're very concerned, again, because of consumer culture, with the quality of our lives, right? And so, we're super sensitive to any impact on the quality of our lives. Our frustration tolerance, our waiting tolerance, all reduced. When I was a kid, I remember my grandfather had these old 8mm Chaplin films. And at that time, when I was a kid, we didn't, you couldn't just push a button and watch something. It wouldn't, you had to wait or you had to go someplace. But I remember we had the Sears catalog. I don't know if you had something like that in Australia, but the Sears catalog was this huge. They were the target of their day. They had everything, right? But they had everything from clothing to 8mm movie projectors. And you'd have to wait. I had to wait 6 weeks.
From when you ordered it and the time it came. Right? Wow.
6 weeks.
It's unheard of.
Unheard of, right? next day, next day, next. But that anticipation, that waiting, was also part of the process of and the excitement, and then getting it and unboxing it. It was all part of it. We've, because of consumer culture, I believe that we've kind of compressed time, and so there's also, while there's this urgency to connect, there's also this expectation that it should be a done deal. Even in my own research, I mean, I found people, I haven't found a relationship yet. Like, a relationship is an object to be found, right? And it's a very interesting conceptualization. Like, I'll just stumble upon one, right? But I think that the way in which we frame those things also can become problematic in terms of going back to your question, where do we go from here? So where do we go from here? I think part of it is the navigation between, wanting something that, i.e., a relationship, and its workability, right? What makes a relationship potentially workable will somewhat be cultural, but also will be individual. And so it's for instance, I often find that couples are trying to borrow one another's will to change. So I'm sure you've run into this yourself, where, especially, as your book comes out, when we think about desire discrepancy, one person wants more sex, the other person doesn't, and the other person feels bad about the fact that they're not giving sex, and tries to change. And of course, 3 years later, nothing has really changed. You can't borrow anyone's will to change, right? It has to be something that's a problem for you, that you want to do something about. But if that's not the issue for you, then you're not going to change, and you're going to feel bad, and your partner's going to feel like you're not giving them what they want. And so this becomes problematic. But the reason someone might want sex is multiple, has multiple causes, right? If a person wants sex for their reassurance as a desirable person in a relationship, well, that's a never-ending. It's going to be never ending. And it also can be at the expense of other ways that you are being valued and appreciated.
That's one of the crucial things. And I mean, I do write about this in my book, is this the notion of examining one's own motivations for sex, whether they want to do it, or even if they don't want to do it, why do they want it to change? Because I think, especially when it comes to exploring mismatches in libido, often people with the lower libido in a couple will be like, what's wrong with me? Why don't I want sex? And I find that question of, humming around into why you don't want sex, even if you had the answer, maybe because it's boring, or you don't like it, or it hurts, or whatever, if that's the case, then certainly that needs to be addressed. But oftentimes people will say, no, it's none of those things, but I don't know why I don't like it, or I don't want it, rather than asking yourself, well, why do you want it to be different then? If you do want it to change, why do you want it to change? And that implication, even in a sex context, that it has to be, about the other person, maybe that I don't find the other person attractive anymore, or maybe that I don't love that person anymore. And maybe those things are true, but also a lot of it, as you're saying, is coming back to one's relationship to oneself. What do you want to get out of the sex? Is it for validation? Is it to be affirmed that you're gorgeous and sexy and desirable? Is it because you're horny? Is it because there are just so many things? But because our collective point of reference about building a connection with another person is oddly external, it's almost like we're walking into encounters, sexual or intimate, emotional, whatever, with an empty cage, and being, oh, hi there, potential partner. Would you like to fill my cage? Because I can't. I've got nothing to put in there, but you sure as hell can put all this stuff in there that's going to make me feel better about myself. And I think when relationships start like that, like, what you can do for me to boost me up, it's a recipe for disaster.
Oh, it is. It is.
Even if it's just for a one night stand, it's like a sugar high. You come crashing down afterwards and feel like, ugh, what was that?
What was that? It's true. It's very true, right? And so one of the things that we're talking about here is affective honesty, right? To be affectively honest is to be able to express your experience of something very simply. But that's not so easy because at the same time, we're concerned about the relational being maintained, right? So often I'm compromising my affective honesty by, either withholding or putting out bits and pieces, or, ignoring my own experience for what I believe is the sake of the well-being of the relationship. And so the relationship also then becomes objectified. It becomes ossified. It becomes something that then has to be protected from my affective honesty, right? Which is what leads to, potentially leads to emotional closeness. Most of the time when people come into therapy, couples therapy, either they're dealing with issues of emotional closeness or they're dealing with issues around sexuality. Those are the two things. They get enacted by power and control dramas, but that's really the efforts made to preserve this ideal or idea of the relationship rather than actually relating in an affectively honest way. There's this, I hear this all the time. Again, self-help culture has really, really been very damaging to relationships and to people in many ways, in that, it says that, you should be fulfilling your own needs and wants. Well, that's just bullshit. We don't do that. We are interdependent. We are interconnected. You can't solve loneliness by trying to fortify yourself. While loneliness itself is a subjective experience, I was writing about this in my dissertation. Loneliness is not something in psychotherapy we treat, but it is a huge contributor to depression. And, if you've been swiping a lot and not very successful, you get into a space that Marty Seligman used to call learned helplessness, where you don't feel like you're being effective in this area of your life. And after a while, it's just going to feel like crap. And so, and that's a problem. That's a real problem with swiping culture. That's a real problem with this objectification and consumerism, in that, how can you be effective if you're behaving like a consumer or a consumed object? In other words, one of the things in consumer science I've always found so funny is they talk about choice overload. Well, now we have the illusion of choice overload. We believe in that we're making choices. We believe we have so much agency about the choices that we make. And, we don't, hopefully, it's not like I'm choosing olive oil on a big shelf thing. It's not, we're talking about real live human beings, right? And so, and human beings can do, as my friend John Fredrickson always says, they can do one of three things. They can meet your needs, they can not meet your needs, and they can want to meet your needs, but not be able to meet your needs, right? And so if we're not actually affectively honest about that, then we run into problems. Now, psychotherapy itself has also done a number on our capacity to be affectively honest, because now we talk about stimuluses as actual experiences.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this is communication becomes very important. So if I say to you, I feel so hurt by what you did. You really disappointed me. I'm so upset with you, right? It sounds like I've communicated a whole bunch of things.
When all you've told me is an emotional experience you're having, but you haven't given me any context or any history.
I haven't given you context, but I'm also only I'm only a subject in that, right? So let's say you actually did something to me, we had plans and you canceled, and the reason you canceled was one that I don't code as something, as significant.
I had to wash my hair.
You had to wash your hair, right? And I haven't seen you in ages. And I could say to you, I was really disappointed that you had to cancel our getting together. Where does that leave you?
Well, it leaves me. So you say to me, so I say, I'm not coming to dinner. I've got to wash my hair. And then the next day you say, hey, I was really disappointed. I guess my response would then be, tell me what disappointed you.
Right. So we get into a therapeutic conversation as opposed to,
right, because I'm a trained therapist. Of course,
right,
that's what I'm going to say.
right. And it's really different than I saying,
what would a normal person say?
Right, but it would really look different if I said to you, I was you really disappointed me last night by canceling over washing your hair. I'm really pissed at you.
Mm-hmm. Right. Then I would know exactly where I stood with you, what was going on, and then it would be determined by the degree to which I could tolerate hearing you tell me you were angry.
Yes. And so this is a real problem, because therapeutically we're living in a therapeutic culture where anger means hurt. Anger means disappointment. No, anger, it means anger. And it means that I have actually some power and that there's a force here, right? That isn't okay with being, tossed aside for washing your hair. Now, in your world, washing your hair could be very important.
Very important. Look at my hair.
I know, right? But when we talk about being seen, heard, and understood, it doesn't suggest change, right? And so this is a very important aspect of this. In other words, wow, I could get that you'd be angry about that. That makes sense. That's all it is, right? It's my ability to let go of whatever position I might be about washing my hair and have the willingness to see what your experience is. That's all. It doesn't mean I agree with it. It doesn't mean I support it. I can see it. I can get it. And so what people tend to do, though, when they're communicating, if I said I'm angry at you about canceling last night, what they tend to do is go into excuse making, which then actually doesn't suggest to me like my message is getting across to you, right? Or that I am actually being seen, understood, and that my perspective is being valued, just my perspective, right? That it's already being minimized, dismissed, moved aside, right? But if I say to you, I'm hurt and I'm disappointed, I've engaged in a socially more acceptable way of telling you that I'm pissed without telling you that I'm pissed. And so now I have to hide my anger from you, which means that I'm not really being affectively honest. I'm doing a little bit of a kind of, dance around it.
Yeah. And I think that that's the thing about anger, and especially certainly in the way that women are socialized around not being allowed to be angry, and that, female anger or feminine anger is, it flips you into sort of screaming banshee territory where it doesn't need to be, obviously, but because women are so heavily conditioned to not be angry and to instead, cry and be disappointed and, be vulnerable and tender rather than sort of being embodied enough in the moment to say, actually, I'm really angry because of this and this and this. And that anger doesn't have to equate to violence. Anger doesn't have to equate to having a tantrum. That simply with the eyes and the tone, one can express anger, and it doesn't have to always be about drama. It can just be a statement of fact. I'm angry. But I can handle myself. I can tolerate my own anger. So therefore I can share it with you and say, I'm angry, and hope that you can also hold your own and mine.
And to be able to receive anger. But part of that reception, as you say, we have, how women are socialized in this culture around tend and befriend, right? The avoidance of anger, or the avoidance of anxiety, right? So where things, you say weepy, or they go into kind of a role very often, kind of a victim role, which engages in sort of the feeling sorry for me kind of energy. But what happens often by the other is that they don't know what to do with that, because there's no there. There's no place to go with that, right? As opposed to, giving up that position and actually saying, allowing anger to power you up, allowing it to be very clear about, what it is that you don't like. And again, you may not be able to do anything about it, right? But the notion that temper tantrums, right? We often conflate. I was thinking about this the other day. I think about it a lot. we often conflate the experience of anger with its expression, and usually it's poor expression. And so because anger tends to be a regressive emotion, when we regress emotionally, we tend to regress cognitively. So we're trying to protect the other and the relationship from crimes not committed. And by doing that, we constrain it, we become more anxious about it, and then we're more likely to act it out or act it in, either in the forms of temper tantrums or outrages or bad behavior outwardly or bad behavior inwardly, right? So it's true, right? My capacity to be able to, historically, if I have, lots of murderous rage that's been collected over the years that I'm suppressing, repressing, avoiding in some way, then anything that activates it, there's this huge forward charge. And this is the benefit of therapy, where you get to drain some of that so that, when you have to wash your hair, I love you and I'm pissed at you that you did that, and I can understand, and, I still love you. Right. But if you've done that chronically and I've kept my mouth shut, then I've allowed, people will say, I feel resentful. Well, if you feel resentful, the likelihood is you've been collecting angers.
Yeah. And then it builds and it builds and it builds. And also then for me as the hair washer, to understand that if I pull out at the last minute because I'm washing my hair when I could have had my shit together and washed my hair the day before and organized myself a little better, knowing the impact of my, cavalier attitude to hair is going to impact your well-being, then that's on me also to show up better as a better partner or friend or wife.
Yes, absolutely. If we get there, right? But if this is happening often, then I have to either do one of two things. Either this is not acceptable to me, or it's something I can accept and understand. But it's going to then impact, how I make plans with you. Right. And that's where this gets, really challenging. Can I allow you to be me? Can you allow me to be me? Right. And can we co-create together rather than, and if you are able to be that level of authentic and honest, right, to say, you know what, I see your point. I do this often. I leave my hair washing to the last minute. I cancel plans. Let me take a look at that. Then we're actually creating together. But if you don't know I'm pissed, and I go, oh, you had to wash your hair. Okay. So then we make another plan. Now I'm collecting.
Yeah, right. And that's when shit starts to get stinky.
That's right. So, to even be able to use the word "I'm angry at you" is already light years ahead of a lot of what people are trying to do. They're trying to contort themselves so that they don't feel angry. So there are two things that are coming to mind. One, the way we avoid direct communication and specifically anger, right? The way that we try to preserve a mythology of our relationship by twisting ourselves up into knots, which happens a lot. I'll hear people say, I have a knot in my stomach. Well, why do you have a knot in your stomach? What are you tying up in knots? Well, I'm very irritated with you. I keep coming and you keep, whatever. Okay. And so how are you experiencing that irritation with me? And that's perfectly understandable, right? So normalizing anger, not crazy expression of it, but normalizing the experience of it is already a connecting. We don't think of anger as a connecting emotion because of the bad ways that people tend to express it and what we've seen, right? And so this is a real challenge. I'm not saying that this is, the social coordination, the social conduct, all of these things that these people talk about, they're not so easy. And they're filled with avoidance strategies.
And that's the thing, that avoidance strategy, that when we can trick ourselves into thinking something doesn't matter, like the hair washing thing. Actually, you're angry. But if we both pretend that anger is not the issue and it's, some other thing that I feel, disrespected, or I feel disappointed, or I feel this, or I feel that, when actually it's just flat out, I'm angry at you because you knew we had this date lined up and you could have washed your hair another time and you didn't make it a priority, and now you're canceling and that's, fucking up my weekend as well. So yeah, I'm angry.
Right, which is really different than, I didn't feel significant to you. I don't feel important to you. Your hair's more important. Whoa, now you're really going down the Cartman drama triangle.
Right.
And
right.
one up, one
and
down.
While those feelings can also be true, I think you can still sort of be holding this, I feel like I'm not important. That can be part of it. But the whole piece about being able to have meaningful connection in the very first instance is, can I be honest with myself about what I'm feeling?
I have a slight difference there. In other words, when I get angry, I'm actually saying I value myself. And I want to be valued. And I don't have to worry about whether or not you're thinking of me as being significant. In other words, I can actually support myself. Right? If I'm saying, I don't feel like I'm significant to you, I'm actually making it your job. And that's going to be experienced in a particular way. And that's going to take us away from, you canceled because you were washing your hair. That's what I'm pissed about. If I start getting into, and this is a big issue in couples therapy, and that often shows up. It isn't so much that, it's not about changing what you like and what you don't like. That's part of your guidance system, right? I may have an issue with, I don't feel like I'm being treated well when you wash your hair and cancel plans on me and don't consider me. But my anger is my consideration of myself and my own experience. Now, whether you can respect that or regard that, that's entirely up to you. So I don't think of those other things as feelings as much as I think of them as thoughts disguised as feelings. Right? Because I feel. Right. I feel that you should take out the garbage. I feel that you should treat me better. I feel, no, I want you to treat me better. And if you're not going to treat me better, then I'm going to have something to say about that. Right. Because otherwise I'm engaging in self-neglect. And I think that's kind of what we wrestle with very often is like, how do I regard you? How do I regard this relationship? And how do I regard myself all at the same time? That's not easy. And so that's when people start talking, at least in my experience, well, relationships are about compromise. Yeah, but nobody ever feels good when they compromise.
Well, that's true. But there is an element of compromise that has to exist in relationships.
Well, let me actually go back over that. The Gottman method, the Gottmans, I love John, his research. I love a lot of what they've come up with, but the implementation of their research is one in which here's what happy couples do. If you're not a happy couple, do what happy couples do. But they never ask, why do happy couples do what happy couples do?
They never ask, why do they do it?
Why do happy couples do what they do?
Do you have a theory as to why happy?
No, because we actually like each other and love each other. That's why we're willing to do those things.
Or because they're thoughtful. But I would also argue, I guess, that because they're probably skilled, like they had to learn these things. They didn't just fall out of the sky.
Well, yeah. I mean, when they look at happy couples, they're not looking at happy couples that went through therapy. They're looking at happy couples who actually just happened by happenstance to be happier, or happy-ish couples. But why do we do what we do, right? Think about we both have dogs.
We do.
And we do anything for them.
Yes, we would.
Why? Because we're in therapy with them? No, because we just
kind of. Maybe some of us are.
Right? But it's not like we had to do some kind of crazy work to establish a loving relationship. And I think people are working too hard, and they're not necessarily working at the right things that actually would be most helpful to them. I don't expect you not to care about your hair, right? I may not know something about women's hair, given my worldview is very different.
Yeah, you've got a very different hair relationship going on. Yeah,
a very different hair relationship going on than you do, and so I may not get it, right? That this is actually I have a but we talk about perspective taking, but perspective taking is not easy, and it really has a lot to do with one's flexibility with one's worldview. That I'm not shackled to my perspective, but that can have, kind of a playful, open perspective about things. And what we were talking about, in this sort of, what I call this sort of Tower of Babel period that we're in, where we don't necessarily know we don't have good social scripts necessarily because they're all up in the air. Then where do we begin? Well, we begin with basic affective honesty. And that's not an easy thing anymore because, we talk a lot about the past and how it influences, how we behave. But the truth of the matter is there are all sorts of social contexts that reinforce that, that reinforce perfectionism, idealism, obsessional behaviors, right? If you're working, obsessional behaviors are very useful, but until they're not, right? So it's not just our own histories that we're trying to navigate. We're also trying to navigate current trajectories that reinforce those kinds of behaviors that are not necessarily, that preclude kind of that, fuck, we were going to have dinner. What the hell? As opposed to, okay, we'll have dinner another time.
Right.
Right.
And then just leaving it.
And then I'll keep you at arm's length and we won't make a plan. Right. And so, and this is right. This is really from the get-go, from the culture of ghosting and breadcrumbing and icing and all these other things that people are doing now. We're not courting anymore. Right. We're not having any anticipatory, right? When Helen Fisher came out with her, neurotransmitters of love, right? From the dopamine and the endorphins and the oxytocin and all that other stuff and the vasopressin, it was like, that used to take 3 years. Now it happens. You barely have to chat with someone on a thing, and you're already at the end of it, right? You've already gotten a divorce, right? So like I said, these little micro practices that we engage in really do move us away from the possibility of emotional closeness and often reinforce things that are antithetical to that. So we have to first acknowledge that as part of our behavior, our practices, and then see, well, what can we do about that? And that's where affective honesty comes in. And that's, we're not good at that. Brene calls
We're not good at that. And sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, Brene calls it authenticity and but now we have the authenticity police, you're not being authentic.
And I think when that all came out, when Brene Brown came out with her TED talk, which I guess is probably about 10 years ago, the vulnerability one, which was amazing, and she broke the internet with that, rightly so, because it's incredible. And her work has consistently been very insightful and very powerful. But I remember, when that all came out and there was this sort of trend on the social media of the day, it was, Facebook primarily at that time, of people sort of taking this notion of vulnerability and authenticity to almost an Oscar level performance where people are, crying and declaring all these, things, confessing all their sins and all this stuff.
Performative authenticity.
And I found that astoundingly uncomfortable, even as somebody who is a therapist who's very comfortable with people expressing complex emotions, to open Facebook and to see torrents of people just going, I'm going to be vulnerable, I'm going to be authentic, and just spewing out all this stuff. I was just like, whoa, hang on a minute. And, later on, Brene Brown did come around and say, that is not what I'm talking about. That is not what vulnerability is. But you increasingly see this. And again, I think social media, especially social media therapy has contributed to that so much because of this, trying to take these incredibly complex topics like what we have, on the Erotic Philosopher and all of these episodes, to condense them down into little, squares which, I know I'm guilty of that too. On my Instagram, it's full of those little bite-sized snacks, because that's what people are on Instagram for, is for a little snack. They're not going to sit down and have a banquet, but they'll take a bite out of something. So at least there is something there. But we've mistaken, I think, depth work in coaching and therapy and consulting and whatever you want to call it. We've mistaken depth work for, if I just do a bunch of liking on Instagram, then I'm an expert in vulnerability.
I'm an expert, and now I can have a relationship.
And everything else, yeah.
Everything else. But even Brene Brown, right? What you mentioned her TED Talk. Even Brene Brown in that TED Talk mentions how she understood conceptually all the research that she had done, right? And then went for therapy. And that's when her work actually began. And I think what's happened now is that, one, people don't understand necessarily what therapy can really offer them. I think there's a lot of conflation with what I'll call very poor coaching, right? And I'm a fan of coaching, right? When Thomas Leonard, must be 30 some odd years ago, began sort of this coaching movement, there were very interesting people that I became friends with who were becoming coaches that were very aware of the complexities of human beings. And coaching was not just about being a cheerleader, but it was about helping people address things in their way from their own performance, but in a wide variety of different ways. But what happened was that it became something that then started to really connect with the business movement, right? And the business movement was about optimization, leveraging, emotional intelligence was co-opted. A lot of different things were co-opted within that context. But what therapy does, from my vantage point, is it helps, I think of therapy in a very particular and peculiar way sometimes. There was a great movie done by Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder years ago called Young Frankenstein. And it's a spoof. So it's not Frankenstein, it's Frankenstein. It's not Igor, it's Igor, right? And Marty Feldman, the great British actor, played Igor. And Dr. Frankenstein meets Igor at the train because now he's being taken to the Transylvania castle. And at some point, Dr. Frankenstein turns to Igor and puts his hand on his back. And he says, I'm a very gifted surgeon. I can help you with that hump. And Igor goes, what hump? And that's what therapy is, right? Therapy is what you don't see that you engage in habitually that actually causes you the most of your difficulties, right?
That's a really interesting analogy. I never thought about it like that.
It's hard, right? You come to therapy and you're doing things that you don't really recognize as not helpful, but you do them because they've been habituated over time. They are adaptations to earlier experiences, definitely, but they become adaptive in some ways in later life, and they become reinforced, and they impair our ability to know things about ourselves. And often what they impair are impulses and feelings that we have, what we like, what we don't like, how we feel about things. And it's very, childlike under all that mishigas.
Yeah, I say that to a lot of the couples I work with, that a lot of the time, we're operating from the place of being 2 or 3 years old. Like our language is much more sophisticated, but our visceral pinging back and forth, we're just really, a bunch of preschoolers still. And if we cannot accept that about ourselves, that we're operating at the level of a 2 or 3 year old at an emotional level, cognitively we're more advanced, but emotionally, a lot of us are still in that 2, 3 year old place, especially when it comes to stuff like sex and romance. We are really operating from this very, very juvenile, tender part of us. And if we can't be kind to that part of us, there's no way, to be able to see that part in somebody else either. If it makes us uncomfortable to be with ourselves at that level, to be with another at that level is really hard.
One of my mentors used to say, if we're lucky, we're approaching adolescence when it comes to relationships. If we're lucky, right? And it's true, right? There is a kind of, I want to go back. Anything can be used as a defense against something else, including anger, including being hurt, including, taking a one-up position or a one-down position. All of it can be used as a defense against something that's more core and more central and more childlike. Childish is different for me, right? I'm not talking about being childish. I'm talking about that sort of childlike, hey, we had plans. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that, and on conversely, also the positive feelings, right? I mean, a lot of people are very parsimonious when it comes to, thank you. That meant a lot to me. I love it when right? And we're not that freedom. I mean, it's very, I think of therapy as being something that's very humble in its outcomes.
Well, that's often, I think, why relationships with dogs can be so much easier, because they're also at that 2 or 3 year old level. And dogs, if they appreciate you, you feel it, you know it. If they're angry with you, you feel it, you know it. Like there's no games. There's just
it's just very straightforward. And then you can kind of it makes the coordination that much easier. If I'm not going into a role, right? In other words, I don't want to become compliant. Right. I don't want to be defiant. I don't want to be in a one-up. Oh, okay. So she has to do her hair, and that's more important than I am. Mm-hmm. Right. Or, oh, yeah, your hair is
the spin we put on things, the meaning we put on things that can be the hurtful part that, you washed your hair, so that means.
Or you don't want to have sex with me, and that means I'm not attractive. Right. Even in my own relationship, it's been very difficult since the post-prostatectomy. I don't feel sexy. I don't feel comfortable. Doesn't mean I'm not horny, but it doesn't mean I feel like, touching me or being touching feels very good to me. And so, but I have to make that, if I don't make that explicit, then everybody's in the dark. Right. So that's what I mean about that level of honesty that's kind of required to participate. And if we're only shopping and we're only behaving in a consumer mentality, if we're objectifying the other and ourselves, those things get harder to do.
And that brings us full circle, Eric, to the end, unfortunately, of this episode. I could sit and chat with you all day. But for people who are listening and watching this on YouTube, how can people reach out to you from all corners of the world?
All corners of the world, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it. I do have a website. It's ericgschneider.com, ericgschneider.com.
We'll put the links in the show notes to be able to find
I am on Facebook on occasion. I putter around.
You pop up on Instagram
periodically. Right. When I'm inspired about something. But yeah, I'm not hard to track down. I am on Clubhouse periodically to do other things, but I really appreciate it.
Is that still going, Clubhouse?
Still going. It's a kind of a fascinating context. But
yeah, I know you enjoyed it at the beginning. I never jumped
at the beginning,
on that fast, but
I had taken time off from work. And so, yeah, I enjoyed it in the beginning. Now I don't have time for it. I just don't have time for any of those things.
Don't have time for these things.
Anyhow, it was lovely to hang with you.
Lovely as always, Eric. Mwah. Mwah.
And give Gomez a big hug and a kiss for me.
I will. He's sleeping in the sunshine.
I understand. All right, love. Be well.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Eric and appreciate his insight into building intimacy and building connection when we've really never been taught how to do it. To continue following Eric's work, be sure to check out the links in the show notes. As always, here on The Erotic Philosopher, I really appreciate having you join me here for each and every episode. And one of the ways that we can get this news and information out to more people just like you is by increasing our visibility, increasing our popularity. And that is where you guys come into it by leaving us ratings and reviews. It might seem like a pain in the ass having to do that, but it's one of the ways that we can really boost our accessibility to people who might not otherwise find us. In order to do that, it's very easy. Just go to my website, cindydarnell.com. That's CYNDIDARNELL.com. Select the podcast tab. You will see all of the past episodes of The Erotic Philosopher right there, including the link to leave a rating and review on iTunes. You'll also see a link there where you can leave a question for future erotic philosophers to ponder. While you're there hanging out on my website, consider subscribing to my newsletter and also checking out my suite of online classes in the Online Pleasure School. You can also work with me for therapy, coaching, and counseling. I work with individuals, couples, and polycules all over the world via Zoom. You can follow The Erotic Philosopher on Instagram and Twitter. We are at The Erotic Philos, that's PHILOS. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Cindy_Darnell. And with that, we've come to the end of this episode of The Erotic Philosopher. I love having you here each and every time, and I look forward to being in your ears again soon. Until then, take care.